Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. Brought to you by the good people at CACI, Center for American Culture and Ideas. Ant, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
We had a Toyota van with 325,000 miles on this thing. And, of course, moving to Virginia, we had to have it licensed in Virginia. And so I take it to get licensed, and it fails the inspection. And so we take it to our mechanic to have him look at it. And he calls me up and he says he couldn't get it on the lift. Did I tell you this story?
You did not.
I don't know why I'm asking you. You wouldn't remember anyway. He calls
Probably
me.
right.
He says he couldn't get it on the lift to inspect it because the frame was so rusted out, he was afraid it would break in half.
I think you better get rid of that van.
Well, we did. So we got rid of the van, and I ended up buying what...
Tell me you didn't sell it to some unsuspecting fool.
Oh, I traded it in for $100. That's all they would give me.
That seems right.
I ended up buying something I never thought I would buy, and I really didn't go in looking for it. It just kind of presented itself at the right time with the right things. And that is a Toyota. And the name of this Toyota is ridiculous. It's BZ4X. It's all electric.
Oh, geez.
I'm loving this thing. It's a wonderful car. But here's the odd thing. In researching it, I came across a reference that I had never heard before. Something called a compliance car. And I came across it in the context. This guy was making a video about the BZ4X. And he says in the video, I thought at first this was a compliance car, but now I think it isn't. I'm thinking, I've never heard this thing. He doesn't give any explanation. So I'm Googling, what the hell's a compliance car? And of course, it makes perfect sense. States impose, principally California, these onerous mileage regulations that your cars have to get so much mileage and so on and so forth. And the regulations, more often than not, don't apply to individual cars. They apply to the fleet of cars the manufacturer produces. Right. And so manufacturers will produce these things called compliance cars that are stripped down, they get extremely high mileage, and they're not really intended for sale. I mean, they do sell them.
Nobody actually buys them.
Yeah, nobody
They sell
actually,
like 6 or 7.
Right. Yeah. But it's to go on the books as here's a car that we produce that gets incredibly good gas mileage that jacks up the gas mileage of the other cars.
The one you got is an offset for the Toyota Tundra.
It's an offset, exactly. That whole business about the compliance cars reminded me of, remember when we were kids and families with children always had station wagons. Everybody had a station wagon, right? And the station wagons disappeared to be replaced by minivans. And it raises this question, well, why the switch? Like station wagons completely gone, all minivans in their place. And the reason is similar to this business with the compliance car. The EPA measured the average gas mileage of cars that manufacturers produced, and it had to be above a certain amount. This is going back to the gas crisis of the 1970s, and the EPA says, we're going to get efficient here, so your gas mileage has to be above a certain amount. And station wagons got horrible gas mileage. We had one, and I was old enough to be cognizant of it. It got 9 miles to the gallon. And what happened was the manufacturers got rid of the station wagons, replaced them with the minivans. Why? Because the station wagons legally are classified as cars. The minivans legally were classified as trucks and therefore fell under different EPA standards.
And they got much better gas mileage anyway.
Oh, they did end up getting much better gas mileage, but they were held to a different, more lenient standard than cars were.
I always wondered what role the mandate of child seats played in that. You could get child seats into a minivan, probably twice as many as you could into a station wagon.
Yeah.
I bet that played too. Anyway, these are nice unintended consequences if we ever write that book.
Right. Yeah, unintended consequences. You get impose EPA regulations and you get compliance cars.
And then you buy one.
I didn't buy one. There's not a compliance car. I really love this car. I think it's wonderful.
Well, my thing this week is much funnier than yours. And I want to point out ahead of time that this is not the foolishness of the week. I find I'm saying that a lot lately.
Yeah.
And, God, we must have an election coming up if I'm saying this every week. But Donald Trump went on television on his preferred news network, Fox, and was asked what his pronouns were.
What? A, why would someone ask Donald Trump that? B, why would Fox ask that?
Well, I think Laura Ingraham was just trying to stir the pot of evil stew. Anyway, it wasn't the question that was funny, it was the response. He said, "I don't want pronouns." I think perhaps missing the point on what pronouns actually are.
Well, you have to remember, the guy used to refer to himself as the Donald.
The Donald, right? Could that be construed as a pronoun? I don't know. I'm an aficionado of all things written, as you well know. And yeah, I don't know that could count. Nonetheless, Donald Trump from here on out apparently has no pronouns. She followed up with, "Oh, so that means you're fluid, right?"
Oh, no.
Further confounding the former president.
Did you see steam coming out of his ears?
Nobody even knows what that means, he said. Ask her to describe exactly what that means. Nobody knows. I think some people know.
Yeah.
You think about it any way you want, but I think people know. Nonetheless, just an interesting tidbit from the campaign trail, which, of course, brings us to the foolishness of the week.
But hang on. Before you go to the foolishness, I just want to point out how much airtime and consequently money was wasted on that set of questions when they could be asking him things like, what's your position on tariffs? What's your position on minimum wage? What are you going to do about poverty? All kinds of interesting things could have filled that space that would have been useful.
Coulda, but didn't. Can I say it now?
What?
Can I say it now?
Say what?
And that, of course, brings us to the foolishness of the week. This is one, the minute I saw it on TV, I knew it would be the winner. And I knew the steam you just described to be coming out of your ears. But for the very first time, I believe, we go to Kamala Harris for the foolishness of the week. And we're going to talk about candidate attitudes later. It's just a couple of minutes. But, Kamala Harris didn't really have much by way of policy prescription as she started to run for the presidency. And all at once, a couple of things started coming out of her mouth to indicate what sorts of policies she was going to be interested in pursuing as president. And I think the very first one was this anti-price gouging business directed towards grocery stores. And I've talked about grocery prices a lot over the past 2 or 3 months, and apparently Kamala Harris heard us or something and decided, yes, I'm going to do something about these grocery prices. So what does she say? She says she's going to stop the price gouging at the grocery stores. How is she going to do this? Don't know. How is it going to work? No idea. But this is her goal. She is going to stop the price gouging at the grocery stores. And in an environment which was nothing but friendly to her, right? The press was treating her with kid gloves. No one dared say a bad thing about Kamala Harris. Boy, they jumped on her on this.
Oh, did they? Good. Good.
Everywhere I look, there's another article about why economists say this is idiocy.
I mean, it's idiocy to begin with, but she picks grocery store, the slimmest profit margin. She could have picked oil if she wanted to.
Well, then she would have had to attack the margins that were achieved by state governments, who make way more than the oil companies do. But yeah, look, grocery stores are a 1% to 3% margin. Mm-hmm. Everybody thinks that American businesses are making 40% margins, which is absurd. 1 to 3 on the grocery stores. Some products you buy at the grocery store, they sell you at a loss.
Right, yeah.
They call them loss leaders. They're the things in the flyer that you look at and you say, ooh, I got to go to Fry's this week instead of Albertsons.
And anyone who wants to verify this, easy way, go to Yahoo Finance. They have great data there. Yahoo Finance, look up the summary statistics on any company you like. In fact, I challenge anyone who's skeptical to start with Walmart. And the last time I looked, their profit margin was like 2.5%.
And the reason is obvious. They made a decision years ago when Sam Walton opened one store that it was better to sell a lot of things at slim margins than to sell a few things at huge margins.
Right.
And that's been their business model ever since.
Yeah. Now, if you want a few things at huge margins, go to Apple, for example.
That's exactly correct. Apple has some of the highest margins of any business in the United States and somehow manages to avoid criticism.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't hear Kamala Harris saying, yeah, how much did that MacBook Pro cost you?
Yeah.
We're going to take care of those bastards over at Apple. Oh, and not having exhausted her ambition, she's also proposing a $25,000 credit of some kind to be delivered in some way to new home buyers.
Wow. Did we learn nothing from 2008?
No, and she's real short on details on this one. You know, how exactly will this work? And a bunch of people started jumping up and down saying, oh, hooray, now people who can't afford houses will be able to. What they're not realizing is that they'll pay for that.
Right, yeah.
I mean, they think that the money just comes from nowhere. I guess sometimes it does, but then you get massive inflation.
Well, you remember what happened the last time the government intervened so that people who couldn't afford houses could buy them. When the government stepped back, they still couldn't afford them, and the housing crisis then ensued.
Yeah, it was fascinating business when that came along. But I suspect if this $25,000 credit business goes through, 2 years later, we're going to see people defaulting on their mortgages.
Yep.
And you heard it here first, and we took no joy in saying it.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers.
Seeing as how we've already broached the subject of both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, we might as well talk about the election, which we have not yet done. But we're under 80 days now, and it's probably time.
It is probably time, and I don't know about you. I haven't been interested in discussing it, despite the fact people are constantly sending me polls about Trump is up or Harris is up or whatever it is, because if you look historically, the poll numbers this far out don't matter. In fact, back when it was Trump versus Hillary, I have to go back and look at the numbers, but I believe Hillary was leading all the way up to like the week before the election, and then it turned just slightly.
You mean it turned just enough?
Just enough, yeah. But the thing is, if you look at that as this is random noise, if the election had been held a week earlier or even perhaps a week later, it could have gone the other way. That to me is not telling me anything about what people want. It's just telling me randomness.
You can see something here, and it's an interesting thing that you can see, right? Because Biden, he was just down. He was a few points below Trump no matter what.
Right.
And
right.
It was looking for all the world like it was going to stay that way for the entirety of the race. And the Democrats, and I think it's going to be very interesting in 20 years' time when we finally get the true story about how all this happened. My guess is that we're going to hear that the 25th Amendment argument was brought up to Joe, and he was told if he didn't withdraw, they were going to execute on the 25th Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
I think they gave him that choice, and given that choice, he had no choice but to withdraw.
Yep.
Now, do I know anything? No, I don't. I have no sources inside on this. I'm just telling you that I think that's what happened.
Mm-hmm.
What we ended up with was a candidate that nobody really knew. Kamala Harris, typical vice president, right? Always around, never doing anything. That's the job. You can't really criticize her for that. But as they like to say, one heartbeat away from the presidency. well, okay, she's apparently the candidate, and we don't even know that for sure because the Democratic National Convention has not yet happened as we record
When
this.
is that supposed to happen?
I think it starts tomorrow.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, it's in the next few days. By the time this episode airs, it will already be happening.
Yep.
Or will be completed. I don't see anybody mounting a successful challenge to her, especially because as Biden was down a few points, she is up a few points.
Mm-hmm.
And isn't that interesting? Why? Until 2 days ago, she didn't have any policies.
Oh, well, because I think she's none of the above.
Well, think about this. She was better off not having any policies.
Right. Yeah. There was nothing you could throw arrows at. Yeah.
That's right. And if you go back and you look at the last bunch, let's maybe start at 1980 and work forward, as is our typical custom when we think about presidential election. There's no hard, fast academic reason for this. It's just because our political memories stretch back to then.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, I remember a bit of the Carter administration and the Ford administration, but I really remember most things from Reagan forward.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just what we choose to talk about as our interval. You get an interesting thing when you look at the candidates and the attitudes with which they approach the campaign for the office. And I think it starts with Reagan, who was relentlessly optimistic, cheerful, and happy.
Yep.
All the time.
Mm-hmm.
What came to be known as Reagan's Law, never speak ill of a fellow Republican.
Mm-hmm.
It just didn't happen. And what was it for Reagan? Springtime in America.
Was it springtime or morning in America?
And the American people fell over tea kettle in love with it.
They did. And for people who didn't live through it, when he was elected, it was right on the heels of what I would say America looked like in 2022. High inflation, unemployment.
It was a disaster.
Up. It was a disaster, actually much more so than 2022 was.
Much, much more so.
Yeah, think of 2022 combined with COVID. So take out 2021, go 2020 directly to 2022. That's what the United States looked at. And for him to come along and say morning in America, well, on the one hand, it was uplifting. In the other hand, it was, I guess if you were a detractor, it would be Pollyanna-ish. How could you possibly say morning in America?
No, that's right. And people on the other side of the aisle said, what the hell's wrong with this senile old man?
Right, yeah. Uh-huh.
And they were on him like white on rice. It was brutal.
Mm-hmm.
And people also don't realize that that recession remained for the first 2 years of his presidency.
Right.
Things did not turn around quickly.
Mm-hmm.
They turned around, but they didn't turn around overnight. And he never lost that cheerful optimism.
Mm-hmm.
And people don't realize, because we live in a condition now where a few swing states are going to make the difference. The popular vote could go either way, right? It's going to be close no matter how you look at it. Reagan won in a landslide.
Yeah.
I mean, an utter landslide. He won almost every state.
Yeah.
I mean, think about that. Almost every state. And then 4 years later, did it again.
We did the math on him a couple of years ago, and if you look at the percentage of electoral college votes that he garnered, I believe it was the case he was second only to Washington.
Yeah, who got them all?
Yeah, who got 100%. Reagan was like 96% or something.
It was just absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
And how did he do it? It was that smile on his face.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And when you look at the race we've got right now, I see one candidate smiling all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I see another candidate who I've become convinced doesn't know how to smile.
Mm-hmm.
And I hate to say it, but that might be the deciding factor in this election.
Yeah.
It really might be. Everything that comes out of Kamala Harris's mouth about policy is goofy beyond repair. I mean, it's just crazy. It's nonsense that a freshman in Economics 101 would fail the course over.
Yeah, but you got to think about it to get to that. The smile, all you got to do is look.
Yeah, that's right. And let's remember, she's a terrible campaigner.
Mm-hmm.
She ran for president before, didn't do well, and dropped out real early, and got picked up as a vice president. And I'm not afraid to say it, she's a black woman. That's why she got picked. Well, I mean, all right, you pick your vice president for whatever reasons you have, and then the American people decide whether those reasons matter enough to them to vote for the other guy, and they didn't.
Mm-hmm.
So case closed. But now we get Kamala Harris ascending to become candidate for the office of presidency. And I don't know, man, I think she's getting some pretty good advice. What have I seen? I've seen her smiling. I've seen her being cheerful, relatively optimistic. That maniacal laugh that she once had is now gone. They obviously trained that out of her. So she's being handled in a smart way. I wonder if it's going to be too much for the doom and gloom of the Trump campaign to overcome.
Now, you've said something that puzzles me, that she's being handled in a smart way. Because Biden seemed to be being handled in an inept way.
That's right. I don't know who she's got working for her, and I don't know who Biden had working for him.
Yeah.
I don't think Biden is particularly controllable anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think you can drill something into his head and it won't stay there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, look, I'm one of the people who thinks that if Biden isn't capable of being a candidate for the office, he's not capable of being president either.
Sure.
And he should have resigned the office of the presidency as he withdrew from the race.
Sure.
He didn't do that. I understand why he didn't do that. I didn't expect him to do that, but that's what he should have done. A better man would have done that. But Joe Biden is a very proud man, always has been, and he wasn't going to let the last few months of a presidency slip out of his hands that way.
I haven't been looking at polls. How do Democrats feel about, in effect, a candidate being pushed on them?
They don't seem to mind because they think she can win.
Mm-hmm.
If she was 10 points down in the polls, they'd be squawking about it left and right. But not only is she up, she's up in the national polls right now by about 4 points, but she's also up and gaining speed in all of the swing states,
mm-hmm.
which is desperate news for the Trump campaign. And I think that there are two things that are going to play here. And I think the first of the two is going to be the debates. I think Trump needs them now.
Right.
You know he's going to show up.
Yep.
I had my doubts as to whether he'd even show up for the debate with Biden.
Mm-hmm.
And he did, and it couldn't have gone better for him than it did. But he's trailing now. His campaign is in free fall. They don't seem to know what to do. Two good debate performances could turn that all around on a dime.
Yep.
If he shows up and mops the floor with her, she's done.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a Hail Mary out there. There's also the probability of an October surprise on both sides.
Yeah, he's got to overcome himself.
He does, and he had in the last debate. You might recall it was right after the assassination attempt.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed to calm him in a way. And we heard that, okay, he's going to be a lot more conciliatory, a lot more open, a lot more decent. And we saw that for about 20 minutes, and then it was right back to normal.
Yep.
Because as I've said 1,000 times, people born around don't die square.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to get exactly what he is because he's incapable of being anything else. He's not a chameleon. For better and for worse, he is what he is. He's even said that. He looked up one day and said, well, I am what I am.
Yeah.
Quoting that cogent political philosopher, Popeye.
Suppose for a moment, I know this goes off the topic you wanted for today, but suppose Harris wins. How do you think she governs?
I don't know. I happen to believe Harris will win.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's going to be particularly close by the time we get to the day. I've been wrong about presidential campaigns before, so take my prediction with a big grain of salt. That said, the real problem is what happens with congressional races, the down ticket races.
Right.
If she peels off enough support to become president, she probably peels off enough support for Democrats to take Congress. And if they hold both houses of Congress, she's going to govern like a crazy person.
Mm-hmm.
If it's divided government, as we often get, the American people are pretty smart this way. They seem to understand that having one party in Congress and the other in the president, not such a bad idea.
Yeah.
If we get that, well, she'll be painted into a bit of a corner. There'll be only so much she can do. My hope is that we end up with divided government regardless of who wins the top office. Mm-hmm. But boy, if I were advising her right now, I would tell her to stop having policies.
Right. Yes.
Sure, you're going to get criticized for not having policies. Sure.
Mm-hmm.
But that's better than getting criticized for the policies.
Right. Right.
And if you think back, Barack Obama is just about the perfect example of this, right? What are you going to bring to the office, Mr. Obama? Hope and change.
Yep. That's right.
Hope about what and what kind of change? You'll see.
Now that I think about it, the types of policies she's talking about, the price gouging thing, the $25,000 for home buyers, her base would already vote for her. They don't need to hear that.
That's correct.
But she does risk turning away middle-of-the-road people who otherwise might vote for her.
Yeah, and I think she's banking on all of the people who would have wanted a middle-class tax cut probably at this point have children who can't afford homes.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So maybe it's a proxy of some kind to get 2 generations instead of 1.
Right.
In that way, it's not crazy. But boy, there's a lot of people who just bought a house that didn't get $25,000.
Right.
And they're going to be a little cheesed about this the same way I'm still pissed about people who got their student loans forgiven.
Right.
Having worked third shift to put myself through school. Right. And you see that the industrious get punished and the lazy get rewarded. And that's a fine line you've got to walk. Right. Because every time you give something to a group of people, there will be a group of people who didn't get it, but would have had it come along a year before. And they're going to, I think, pretty necessarily be pretty bitter over the whole thing.
Yeah. And you encourage more people to show up next time in the group that gets the money.
That's right. This grocery business, I think, would generally be a winner because everybody's so angry about the prices at the grocery store. But she latched on to exactly the wrong answer.
Yep.
And she's even getting called on it by the press, which is something I didn't think I would ever see.
Yep.
I thought the press would anoint her and give her a free pass on every single thing out of her mouth, the way they do with Democratic candidates year after year after year. But it turns out this is just too stupid to let her get away with. And I'll leave a couple of examples in the show notes of articles from typically friendly sources that came down on her like a ton of bricks. I'm working from the AP article today, but there were plenty more. In the end, Dan, I'm really interested in watching this play out, right? I'm watching a smile and a scowl. And in the end, a smile always appeals to our better angels. Mm-hmm. Whether you agree with the person or not, a scowl doesn't. A scowl gets to our vindictive, nasty side. And we each have both of these sides.
And think back to the Kennedy-Nixon debate. There's a beautiful social or inadvertent experiment. People who listened on the radio said Nixon won. People who watched on television said Kennedy won. Because Kennedy looked better. He looked younger. He looked fit. He was made up well.
He was smiling. And what came out later was that Nixon had a very severe and painful back injury. and he was forced to stand at a podium, and he broke out into a pretty significant sweat, and it was just a bad look all the way around. But as you say, everybody who listened to it on the radio knew for a fact that he won that debate. I have listened to that debate, and he did win it. I don't think there's any doubt. But when you watched it, it was different.
Mm-hmm.
And when I watch Kamala Harris and I watch Donald Trump, I wonder how much further a man spewing hate is going to get.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time,
Send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.